ASUS has gone and dropped the ROG Ally, and old Reggie here has got himself a proper head scratcher. Does he ditch his beloved Steam Deck, the one he's cherished for the past year, or does he give the Ally back to them Best Buy numpties and stick with Team Valve? Well, in this review I'm going to spill the beans on the ergonomics, game benchmarks, ease of use and bang for your buck. And I ain't stopping there, my pedigree chums. I've gathered a load of tips from them Reddit geezers to squeeze out every last bit of performance, including showing you all some emulation and an SSD upgrade. We've got a right treasure trove to dig in today, so grab yourself a cuppa and let's have a chat. Now let me lay it out for you. Reggie here is recording this on an iPhone at 4K 60 FPS and he's editing it all fancy like in Adobe Premiere Pro at the same resolution and frame rate. But don't be fooled, my mates. I ain't got no fancy studio lighting. I've got no fancy professional gear here. So what you see in terms of benchmarks or visual quality might not match up to what I'm actually seeing. Instead, I'm going to give you a lowdown on what my peepers can make out and how my noggin processes it all. And to make it easy for you, I've split it all up into chapters. So let's dive right in, shall we? Let's talk packaging then, because Greta Thunberg, she's going to be sending Gabe a Christmas card this year because the Steam Deck comes in that recycled brown cardboard box. It's all about sustainability these days, isn't it? And I've got to say, I'm leaning towards ASUS on this one. For my hard-earned $700, I want something flashy, not just a plain old box. Inside the ROG Ally package, you'll find the handheld itself, a 65-watt charger, and a stand that is as flimsy as a Boy Scouts project. It does the job of keeping the unit upright, but it feels like an afterthought if you ask me. Interestingly, the plastic film cover gives you a very helpful hint on how to turn on the device, which whilst you all might think that's taking the piss, recognise that some units shipped with different instructions entirely that were wrong. Sadly, that is a sign of things to come later from ASUS, so watch this space. On the other hand, the Steam Deck welcomes you with a lovely hard case, and let me tell you, it's top-notch quality. Now here's the important bit. A lot of folks, they're talking online about how little extra the Ally costs compared to the Deck, with the Ally sitting at $700 and the Deck, the top version that is, at $649. But when you factor in the additional $40 case from ASUS, the difference is actually closer to $100. And in my book, for that kind of money, a case should come included, especially considering it's a handheld meant for travelling. Valve also throws in a microfiber cloth to wipe away your grubby mitts and a little bag, and they've got some exclusive digital goodies on their store too for downloading. So all in all, why ASUS nails it with the fancy package on the outside, Valve takes the win here in terms of overall consideration and contents. Let's talk about how those devices feel in those grubby mitts, shall we? I've got to admit, it's a tougher decision than I thought, and I've been going back and forth on it. The reality is, both of them feel great in their own way, which makes this a real challenge. The Steam Deck is a proper tank. It's got a solid feel to it, a nice weight, without being too much, and it fits nicely in your hands. I personally prefer the sticks on the Steam Deck because they feel sturdy and responsive. The A, B, X, Y buttons are a tad smaller than the Ally, but they're clicky and enjoyable to touch. However, I ain't a fan of the left and right triggers on the Steam Deck. I think they feel a bit loose to me, and there's no grip texture on them, so they don't feel as responsive as they should. But what the Steam Deck does have is two trackpads, giving your mouse control, which comes in handy in certain games or when navigating with a cursor. And let's not forget the start buttons. They've got a proper layout here, much better positioned, far away from the Steam button, so you don't accidentally press them and mix them up. The plastic itself doesn't feel cheap, but please note, in this review, my Steam Deck is skinned via D-Brand with their premium black leather. You might be asking, why did I reskin the same colour? Because I'm not a child, people, okay? By the way, the skin is lovely and has kept strong this whole time, so highly recommended, and no, I'm not getting paid by D-Brand. Now, the one criticism I have of the Steam Deck is that as a portable device, it might be a tad too big. It's comfortable, no doubt, but after long play sessions, it starts to ache the hands a bit, like you just finished 2 rounds of Pornhub back to back, if you know what I mean. Now, the ASUS is a whole different story. The first thing that struck me about it is how ridiculously light it is. It's so light that at first you might think it feels a bit cheap, but fear not. There's a lot more going on here in the design. The plastic moulding has these fancy sweeping curves and indentations, giving it a bit of flair. The back of the unit even has a shiny finish to attract their magpies. The buttons on the Ally are mostly good. The sticks are positioned in a different layout, however, so at first it does feel a bit odd, like my right thumb's out of place somehow, but now it's become second nature to me. I haven't had any issues with sticky buttons, which I know some folks have reported, and the back triggers, they work fine for me. However, there is one layout issue with the Armor Crate software and overlay buttons. It's right underneath the start buttons for games, and let me tell you, I've hit the bloody wrong button more times than I can count. I'll probably get used to it eventually, but it's something you don't have to deal with on the deck. Now, I've got to mention the major issue with the sticks, but I'll save that for later in the review. I stumbled upon a brilliant post on Reddit that will shed some light on it, but overall, the Ally feels more like a proper handheld device. Its lightness is a game changer, lads. When I switch back to the bulky Steam Deck with all its weight and larger footprint, it feels like a blooming brick in comparison. So the ASUS Ally just about edges ahead in the ergonomics section. When it comes to connections on top, they're pretty much on par with each other, so I won't go into too much detail, but let me tell you, the ROG Ally has a little trick up its sleeve. It can connect to an external GPU in an enclosure. Now, personally, I can't think of too many situations where you're going to need that. Once you start adding an external GPU, you're getting into the realm of gaming laptops, and that brings some bulk along with it anyway. But hey, maybe you're someone who wants to use your ROG as a proper home gaming PC and then take it on the road. Docking it quickly gives you that extra power when you need it, I guess. What I don't like though is how Jimmy Savile it feels all up on top. It's very exposed. I do worry long term about dust and all sorts getting in to this opening, but I guess time will tell. Now, the Ally also boasts fingerprint technology on the power button. Unfortunately, mine can be a bit temperamental, as if my fingerprints got burned off in a past life. So I'm not really giving this feature a thumbs up, to be honest. It's trying to solve a problem that doesn't really exist, and the Steam Deck's power button works just fine every time. Finally are the speakers. Now, sound on both of these devices is excellent, and owning either one is not going to make you feel like you're lost out somewhere. It's surprising just how much they both pack a punch, but for my ears, the ASUS just heads it, as it feels a little bit punchier and clearer than the decks. One thing I also noticed is that the SD card slot on the ASUS doesn't appear to have a strong enough spring mechanism, meaning I needed tweezers to put out my bloody card, which is not great and not an issue I have on my deck. So I reckon the Ally just about takes this round by a whisker thanks to its external GPU connections, but overall both devices hold their own, especially with that USB-C port taking centre stage. Now we're getting to the real deal, my mates, and it's the most defining feature of these two devices, and let me tell you, it is mind-boggling that more reviews didn't make a fuss about this, and we're talking about the screen. And let me just say, the ROG Ally absolutely obliterates the Steam Deck screen in every single way. It's a proper knockout. The Ally brings more vibrant colours to the table. We're talking 1080p versus 800p, and trust me, it makes a world of difference. Don't let anyone fool you otherwise. But here's the real game changer, my friends: VRR. The ROG can suck up Riley Reid style any inconsistent frame rates and smooth out those stutters like a smooth criminal, and hold on tight, because it's also got 120Hz refresh rate as well. Not that many games will top that, but certainly older retro titles can. It's a screen that leaves the Steam Deck in the dust, I'm afraid. Now let me be honest with you, on the premium model of the Steam Deck with its fancy anti-glare coating, the screen can feel a bit dulled at times, and what you're seeing in today's videos just don't do it justice. The Ally can actually give the Nintendo Switch OLED a run for its money, rather than worrying about the deck. Once you've experienced that screen, it's bloody hard to go back, especially with games that have vibrant colours and a strong colour palette. And let me tell you, there are certain games like Diablo IV, which we'll see later on, where reading text is crucial for working out your loot selections. The Ally then is an absolute joy to behold, my friends, and for Reggie, it's the screen that truly seals the deal when it comes to decision making. Battery life and performance take a back seat when you're talking about the sheer enjoyment that this screen brings to your gaming experience. And here's another surprise for you: the touchscreen on the Ally is oh so more responsive than its counterpart on the deck. It's snappy, on point, and a breeze to navigate. When using the touchscreen on the deck or trying to use the keyboard feature, it feels like it's dragging its feet and nursing a hangover in comparison. Now don't get me wrong, there's nothing inherent inherently bad about the deck's screen, it still gets the job done, but what's truly surprising here is the stark contrast between the two. The good news, my mates, is that ASUS has shown us how it's done. I reckon the Steam Deck will be the last handheld we see with an 800p screen in the high-end market. Thank you ASUS for showing us the way. So this one, it's an easy win for the Ally here. Now let's shift our focus to the software, where the Steam Deck has a chance to catch up. When I first turned on the Steam Deck, everything just worked. No hassle or fuss, it loaded up quickly, and after entering my details and signing my life away, things started happening. Firmware updates and all that jazz, and I've got to say, in the past year, I've hardly experienced any crashes on the Steam Deck. It's been a reliable companion, my friends. The Linux-based system brings some additional features to the table, like pause resume functionality, which gives it a console-like feel. You can opt right back into your game where you left off at the press of a button. Likewise, it's so easy to shut down a game from the Steam button, not to mention the overlay, which has a raft of options to get things just where you want them to be from a tweaking sense, in particular around power draw for the battery. And when you think about portability and why you've gone and got yourself a bloody handheld, quick and easy gaming is surely the point, right? But here is where the Steam Deck starts to stumble. It's all about game compatibility, my lads. Now, to be fair to Valve, they've been working bloody hard, consistently updating their Proton software to ensure support for as many games as possible. They've really been going for it, but where the trouble begins is with all them different game launchers out there. Some games just won't work smoothly or can be a right pain in the arse to run. Take Diablo IV for example. It requires a bit of tinkering to get going. It's not impossible, mind you. You'll actually find it pretty easy if you follow a guide online, but you'll find yourself hopping around in desktop mode, digging through files, saving them in the right place and setting it up as an app in itself in Steam to launch the Battle.net launcher. The software here actually works like a charm with Steam itself, but when it comes to all them other launchers like Xbox Game Pass, Epic Game Store, Rockstar and Ubisoft, well, you might find you run into a few pain points depending on your technical ability and of course your game library. Likewise, it feels like every time I turn on my deck, I get the compiling shaders message, which almost looks like it's downloading a bloody game. It's not a biggie, but it doesn't happen on the Ally. So while the Steam Deck software experience is generally smooth sailing, it might give you just a bit of grief when it comes to other launchers. And now we're talking about the Ally software, which is none other than full fat Windows 11 on your handheld. Fancy running a launcher? No bloody problem, my mates. Just download it like you would on a regular PC and off you go. Every launcher works smoothly, and I was able to get games up and running eventually, because here's the catch. It's still bloody Windows that we're talking about, and on the ASUS, that means it requires support. And let me tell you, I encountered game crashes, slow startups, a bunch of errors, and a frustrating lack of user friendliness. Microsoft really needs to step up their game here and provide better support for the handheld market, because what we've got here is a bit bonkers at times. Here's a prime example. When you first turn on the Ally for the first time, like the virgin that you are, Windows asks for your Wi-Fi password to get going. But believe it or not, the touchscreen for Windows didn't bloody work, and so there's no way to progress beyond that page. It was like one of them porn pop-up ads that left you with nowhere to turn. In my case, I had to find a keyboard with a USB-C port to enter my password and move forward. Now, I did read somewhere that setting up a second virtual keyboard in the options could also do the trick. It's incredible that ASUS nerds didn't test this shit out though and happily launched it in this way. I've had some bloke fart in my face and leave a better impression than this. It's these kind of shenanigans that just don't happen with the Steam Deck, and I hate to say it, but it only gets worse. All day I was downloading update after bloody update on Windows, and then it was time to download the BIOS updates, and then from there it was the ASUS crates updates and the My ASUS app updates, and some games simply wouldn't load at all on the Ally, even though they work fine on my Windows PC or indeed on the Steam Deck, such as American Truck Simulator. Now, I do show a benchmark of it later, and I managed to get it up and running after much struggling, and I had to do fresh reinstalls and all the rest, but this is what you're getting yourself into. And to make matters worse, there's no pause resume feature on the Ally, so you're stuck with full shutdowns and proper game launches, just like you would on a fully fledged PC. This is a critical point to note, because if you're looking for a handheld that's quick and flexible, well, the ASUS, it just ain't exactly catering to that crowd. It's basically a laptop in the palm of your hand. When it comes to comparing the overlays of the two handhelds, it becomes a bit trickier. I can't deny that the Steam overlay is easier to navigate and offers more options, but we mustn't forget that it took a whole bloody year to get to that point. On the other hand, the Armor Crate overlay on the Ally has many of the same options, allowing you to adjust settings like refresh rate, FPS caps, and even enables features like FSR, Fidelity FX Super Resolution for you nerds. I must say, I was genuinely surprised how good it was, and there were times when I didn't miss the Steam overlay whatsoever. One aspect that impressed me in particular is how they've created a library for your games and launchers for quick access. It works bloody well, and I hope that ASUS doesn't get lazy and abandon this effort, because it's truly a great start on their part. In fact, in the time it took me to do this review, ASUS had released 2 hotfixes for the software, so the omens, they're very promising. So while the Steam overlay still has the edge in terms of navigation and options, the Armory Crate overlay on the Ally holds its ground and provides a solid experience, especially considering it's the first iteration. Now we come on to another banger of a feature that can make or break your decision, and that's the epoxy battery life, which on a handheld device is going to be super important. Just ask my wife. With all the power packed into the Ally, it needs a bucket load of juice to keep it going. In turbo mode, it's running at a hefty 25 watts, and when you plug it in, it jumps up to 30 or even 40 watts, giving you them frames like a proper gaming laptop. But here's the rub: when it's not plugged in, the battery drains quicker than a California lake in a drought. It's a proper surprise how fast it bites the dust, and depending on the game, you might only get 60 to 90 minutes of playtime. But hold your horses, the good news is that the 65-watt charger does a bang-up job of getting it charged up much quicker than the deck does, so there's a glimmer of light there. The software lets you drop down to 10 watts, but even then, it ain't got the flexibility of the Steam Deck, and if you're playing games like Stardew Valley that don't need all that much power. Now ASUS ain't daft, they've clocked onto this and they've clocked onto the other issues, and there's talk of some software updates coming to make it more efficient. There's a rumour that they might shut down some of them CPU cores to save some much needed battery life. Hopefully they will sort it out, but you got to think about your own use case here, lads. If battery life is the dog's bollocks for you, then the Steam Deck is the clear winner. It'll keep you gaming for longer without a worry. But here we are, talking about the Steam Deck's flexibility and its cheeky lower quality screen, but let's be straight here, the Steam Deck's battery life can also run out in bloody 2 to 3 hours. Funny thing is, when it was first announced, we all had a good laugh, didn't we? But now it's seen as the benchmark, and here's the kicker: it's all about the software and the flexibility to tweak those settings on the deck. With the right game adjustments and Steam overlay tinkering, you can squeeze out a decent bit more playtime compared to the Ally, especially in them pixel art style games. The Steam Deck seems to run the same whether it's plugged in or not, and there's something reassuring about that consistency. Now the Ally on the other hand has a bit of a problem. You know that there's power left on the table when it's not plugged in, and it can be a right pain in the arse when you're playing a more demanding game and you just want to use that extra juice. So in this round, the Steam Deck takes the crown, no doubt about it. It's got better battery management and flexibility, giving you more bang for your buck. And now I'm going to talk about some niggling issues with the Ally that just don't exist with the deck, and I've got a few tips to share on them too. First off, let's talk about them joysticks on the Ally. Now there's been a mass debate going on in them Reddit forums about whether it's a software issue, a hardware issue, or if it's an issue at all. Some clever Reddit user named HZ4C wrote a detailed post explaining the input delay and dead zones, and I'm with him on this one. When you're playing first person shooter games, it feels like you got to go full throttle on them sticks to get the movement where you want them, and suddenly it overcompensates. Now compare that to the Steam Deck footage here with its sturdier feeling sticks, and the travel is much less and way more responsive. Hopefully a software update can sort it out, and they have said they're looking into it. But on the flip side, they've also said that they think it's within norms. ASUS, no it ain't. It definitely ain't in norms. It's bloody terrible. Next up, we got ourselves a Windows problem, and it's a big one that can make a real difference, and it's all about the core isolation being left on as standard. Now this here can have a proper impact on performance, and once you turn it off in Windows, you see some great improvements in your gaming experience. Funny thing is, even Microsoft themselves admit that. Now unless you're into watching loads of porn or downloading illegal shite, you don't want this bloody thing left on when you're just playing FIFA. But seriously, why ain't ASUS working more closely with Microsoft on this, especially considering it's a bloody handheld device where performance is everything? And lastly, we got them firmware and updates. Now this ain't so much of an issue, but I gotta say, them benchmarks we saw before the Ally's release are now completely useless. The Ally's adding nearly 15% extra performance to some games now. It's a bit of a shame because the marketing team jumped the gun here, sending out review material when really it wasn't in a good state. state, just like the same bloody marketing team released all the information on April Fool's Day. Well done, give them a raise. But with the nature of the Ally and how Windows will do anything it can to give you a hard time, you've always got to be prepared for these updates breaking things. However, supposedly the latest BIOS of 3.19, which is what you see in all the footage today, it makes games slower than the old BIOS of 3.17. Lots of Reddit posts talk about it, and who are you to believe? I'm honestly not too sure myself. It seemed okay for me, but that's clearly another point for the Steam Deck, which is just ease of use without need for constant faffing. Now, before we dive into them benchmarks, I wanted to give the Ally a little test with a controller and a portable screen just to see how it all works. And I've got to say, I'm properly impressed. This screen, funny enough, is also made by ASUS, and it's got all them fancy features for smooth gaming. And the Starfield controller, which I got because I'm a space whore, connected like a charm over Bluetooth, though I did have a bit of a struggle getting it to work properly with games recognise it as an input, but a Windows restart seemed to fix it all. Now, I've already given this a go on the Steam Deck, and even though I don't have any fancy footage to show you, there's one thing you've got to keep in mind here. Pushing the Steam Deck to 1080p will seriously hamper its performance unless you're playing those retro games. And speaking of retro games, the Ally is an emulation beast. Now, before any of you go shit a brick, have a look at my copy of Zelda here, and lo and behold, it emulates like a dream on the Ally at 1080p. And with its power, I'd say it does a much better job than the deck does, with only fewer stutters and higher frames. Now, a quick word of caution, here I am installing a 2TB SSD. I followed the excellent Thanks and his guide, and it was all spot on, so do subscribe to him for your Ally needs. But my stupid arse struggled with a few of these screws. For the life of me, I could not get the bottom middle screw out, and I was looking at his video over and over because I could see that he'd bloody well done it with ease. And then it dawned on me that the bottom middle screw is captive and should not be removed, so don't force it, my Padawans. Instead, use the tool carefully and pry it open, and away you go with the rest. It was super easy and quick, and don't be alarmed when it doesn't turn on like what you see here. Turns out I'm a proper muppet and should have had this plugged into power. Once you do, everything boots up nicely, and the ASUS recovery works wonders in reinstalling Windows. Now, I suggest you don't touch it in this process, as it can take a bloody long time, so don't be nervous if you're not seeing much action. Honestly, it felt like it took over an hour on my device to get everything downloaded, but it's all automated, so fear not. Alright lads, let's talk about these benchmarks then. Now, I ain't got no fancy software or high-tech camera here. You'll have to just trust me on this one. I got 10 games lined up for the test, and you can find plenty of other reviews on this channel if you want to see more details. Now, all the games here will be set to the same settings on both handhelds, and they're both going to be plugged in with maximum power output. Now, here's the catch. The Steam Deck's going to be running at 800p resolution, while the Ally will be running at glorious 1080p, dropping down to 720 when performance starts struggling. The goal here ain't to give you the most optimized settings, but rather to push the Ally with higher resolutions and see how the deck compares at a lower resolution. We all know the Ally's got some power under the hood, and other benchmarks will give you all them fancy numbers, but what I want to show you here is the real difference in performance between the two and how that conveys in everyday use. Now, keep in mind, both handhelds have the latest firmware updates. The Ally is on BIOS 3.19, which supposedly degrades performance a fair bit, so take that into consideration. Each game will have a minute of video footage, so we don't bore you to bloody death, and in all cases where FSR is available, it's set on both handhelds to balance to give it consistency. Speaking of which, sorry if the lighting is a bit shit here throughout the footage. Like I said, I'm not a professional equipment expert person, just me and my trusty camera that Johnny Two Shoes nicked down Borough Market. Alright, enough chit chat, let's get on with the show and see how these babies stack up. So first up is my shitty driving in the ever-fulfilling American Truck Simulator. This is the Steam Deck 800p at high settings. Now, first thing you do notice here when playing this is the sporadic stutters with lows of 31 frames per second being hit, as you can see here when I turn the corner. Interestingly, if you focus on the blue sky, you can see a sort of screen door effect like you get in VR headsets. But fear not, my Padawans, because that's down to my crappy camera and it isn't reflective of the game whatsoever. However, the sky definitely lacks the deep blue of the Ally screen, as you'll come to see, and indeed the jaggies. They're much more pronounced on the deck due to the lower screen resolution, with the billboards and trees here on the right hand side in particular giving me a little brain aneurysm, and indeed the intersection that we go through later on is full of the jaggy stuff. The deck just can't keep pace with the Ally even though it's running at half the pixels. Remember though, this is not optimised but rather to help you get a comparison against the Ally when we try and keep things as matched as possible. So lowering the settings definitely gets you a smooth experience here, and it's hugely enjoyable to play on the deck. Now the immediate difference in the Ally is clear, and this comes through via the sharp nature of 1080p. Again, the same actual graphical settings as the deck, but what the video doesn't demonstrate is how those frame swings from 50 FPS up and down don't cause any discernible stutters to your eye thanks to its magnificent VRR screen, which kicks in at 48 frames and upwards. Just look at how sharp and detailed the dashboard is compared to the deck, which has a little blur at times, but we have the much sharper textures, deeper blacks, and far less jaggies to contend with. One of the best ways to show this is looking at the blue sky again, where it has more life in it, vibrant blues with more detailed clouds. Worth noting there are no mods installed, and this is the vanilla game, but both deck and Ally could easily hit 60 FPS when optimised, no issue. In this first game though, we can see how the Ally takes a rather large leap over the deck, which raw numbers just don't demonstrate, and yes, I will crash like a tit again. Now Deathloop is an interesting one on both handhelds because it fundamentally shows how poorly optimised this game is. Here we are on the Steam Deck at medium settings at 800p. I warn you, I'm terrible in these clips, but that's because I just wanted to showcase a little open world action. And Jesus on a stick, people, the second you head outside in Deathloop, the game tanks quite hard with heavy stutters and lows of 35 FPS, but then swinging up to 50 FPS. Absolutely though, with optimisation these swings can all be but mitigated, but you're gonna be sacrificing maybe a mix of low to medium settings and maybe a locked 40 or dare I say 30 FPS to get where you need it. What I want you to pay close attention to is the grey rock everywhere, in that it all sort of just merges and blends in together. Again, this is down to the screen quality than it is the performance settings, and in person it's a far more noticeable aspect of the deck versus Ally than what you're seeing through YouTube compression. The level of detail in the rock just fundamentally lacks any sort of depth to it. Interestingly, the Ally matches the deck in every way, other than of course the fact it's pushing double the pixels, so the smoothness just isn't there, and Deathloop at medium settings is just too much for both in their respective resolutions. Apologies for the screen looking a little washed out here too, again that's just down to the iPhone because in person it is crystal clear and vibrant. Now look again at the detail of the rock, it almost looks like an entirely different model at times. One thing to keep your eyes on is my joystick dead zone here, where it felt like I had to be quite brash to get the movement I needed. Sort it out, ASUS. However, this is one game where I feel dropping to 720p and using the FSR options is more beneficial, so that's exactly what I do in the next clip, and boy oh boy does it make a difference. So here we are at 720p, where 45 to 60 frames per second is totally achievable, and I'm sure with some tweaks we can get rid of those lows to keep things quite consistent. But the critical part here of course is that things feel smooth and much more playable now, and what we see now is a total reflection of the Steam Deck settings in every way. Now it's true we lose some details dropping down the Ally resolution to 720p, but what can't be lost here is the superb colour replication and how that pops through, which sadly this video is useless at showing. When compared to the deck at the same resolution, it's still night and day, and for my money this is probably the best way to play the game if you're chasing the 60 FPS. Now watch as I die over and over because I'm a total cock. So this is the big one, people, and Reggie will have a review on this in due course once he feels he's done his time to give a fair and honest view. But I couldn't help but give this one a whirl on the deck because it's the sort of game that's made for it. As I said earlier, it's a little faffing to get set up, but it's totally doable and a very playable and enjoyable experience. The deck here is in medium settings at its native resolution. The route is a simple walk around the main town where I then exit through the southern gate. Now sadly, sadly, the deck just doesn't have the power to give our eyeballs consistency. Everything here just stutters along, and even though it's around 50 FPS as you walk around town, it does feel lower at times as the stutter can be jarring. More so the clarity, it's just not as sharp as it would be on the 1080p of course, and with so much text on screen, especially when going into menus and loot options, it sure does amplify the difference with the Ally. Now as you get out of town, you'll start to see things pick up where it closes in on 60 FPS. I'm not quite sure how well this plays at this setting with a shitload of enemies on screen, but my assumption is that it hurts the FPS quite a lot. Likewise, the white colour of this scene doesn't provide you with the detail to make it come to life as if you're surrounded by fluffy white snow, but rather a slushy mess. In particular, pay close attention to the forthcoming fire effects and compare them to the white snow. Everything here just sort of looks flat, like it's painted on the same plane. One thing to add though, and remind you all again, this is not optimised in its current state as I just threw on the same setting as the Ally, so moving down to a low setting gives a much more consistent experience, and Diablo 4 on the Steam Deck is an absolute dream once optimised. So honestly, boys and girls, the difference the screen makes here just cannot be understated when we start to consider the Ally, and in particular Diablo 4. And it was the first WoW game that I tested where the difference was stark. I can see so much more in the paving stone or the wooden panels on houses or their little thatched roofs. The snow, it has more depth to it, along with some glorious sweeping mist every now and again, which existed on the deck of course. But here, it just feels noticeable. As I'm walking around, pay attention to the details of Diablo 4, because for my money they can all get a bit lost with the deck. You can obviously make out the wooden boxes, but you can't make out the grain on the wood, which you can see with the Ally. Even snowflakes falling from the sky, they seem a little bit more pronounced and therefore immersive. The best bit is the frame rate. Yes, it's consistently stuck at 50 FPS or so in town, but the VRR tech keeps things in check, and with some small tweaks I'm sure I could get this closer to 60 FPS and reduce inconsistency as more enemies hit the screen. And once again, pay close attention to the fire effects you're about to see, in particular how much more orange the fire is compared to the deck. Bloody delightful stuff it is. Truly then, it feels like Diablo 4 was made for the Ally, and it's a great way to play on the sofa, but make no mistake, it also plays great on the deck at lower settings. But for me, 800p Diablo, it just is hard to stomach once you see this in action on the Ally. Next up on the Steam Deck is Divinity Sin 2 800p, but settings now at Ultra. Yes, my lovelies, everything here is maxed out, and the Steam Deck does a sterling job of giving us strong FPS. Now, I'm a muppet, and I picked up a save file from years back, so I can't bloody remember where I am or what the I'm doing, but alas, I went for a little walk around town. Now, it never feels totally smooth, but that's no issue at all to fix when reducing down settings. Remember though, my test is purely about seeing the gulf between the Ally and the deck based on the same settings at their native resolution. Now, this route is pretty basic, but it is a built up area to give an idea of performance, and I'm super impressed with the deck here. However, one thing to note is that Divinity Sin is a hugely text heavy game, more so than Diablo 4, and so the deck, whilst running amazingly well, doesn't have the knockout blow. I also find the trees that are coming up as I turn the corner, they don't have a uniqueness to them. Again, it just feels like everything sort of merges as one lump of green together. But nonetheless, this is a highly impressive showing from the deck, and hitting a solid 60 with tweaks is no problem at all. Now, on the Ally, we come to a bit of a surprise. Yes, it's at a higher resolution, but the FPS is identical, and in some cases even a little lower. It may only be a few frames, but it's interesting nonetheless. Of course, just like the deck, if you want to hit 60, it's going to be no problem here. But the fact is, as it hovers around the 50 FPS mark, the screen sucks up those stutters without issue, and playing this in person, it felt smooth as butter. The colours may seem a bit washed out due to the phone recording, but if you look at those trees again as we turn around that corner of the house, you'll see how there is so much more detail and depth, and the green doesn't feel like it just merges into one. Of course, with all that text in Divinity Sin, 1080p is quite a game changer. It's probably a good time to remind everyone, of course, that these tests are done with power connected, and the ASUS is almost giving double the wattage here for similar FPS to the deck. So for me, the deck is running Divinity Sin 2 in a much more efficient way, and that is something that is vital if you consider the portability factor for a game like this. Next on the deck is Fallout 4, which for me is the perfect type of game for a handheld. A huge open world, great RPG mechanics, and it plays great with the handheld controls. This is 800p at high settings, and the deck does a very good job here, hitting that 45 frames per second mark. But as things start getting busy in this town, the stuttering will begin, where we hit 39 frames per second. As with all the other games, the colours, they don't quite pop on this screen in comparison, but it's absolutely playable. And if we drop the settings down to a mix of medium or low, you're going to be getting a much smoother and consistent frame rate. My issue with older games though is that lower settings do tend to look a little uglier and flatter based on the textures that get used. Now at this point I didn't feel I was giving enough of a benchmark, so I hopped over to Diamond City, one of the busier areas of the game, and as you can see here, we see a dramatic drop down to as low as 32 frames per second, but then it claws back to 55 frames per second, and it's these wild swings on lower resolution screens that you're going to find quite jarring. You will find some edges a little uglier as they lack the fidelity. It was only when I went to the Ally did I appreciate how much detail was actually lost in Diamond City. However, once you reduce the settings down as mentioned, what you have in Fallout 4 is a phenomenal Steam Deck game that should be enjoyed by everyone. As is now par for the course on this benchmark, you can probably guess it, what you're seeing on the Ally at high settings at 1080p is a totally different game. The lighting here, by the way, is a mess, but I managed to get some photos back on the camera shortly, and you'll be able to appreciate just how much of a difference that 1080p screen is. But just look at that power consumption. A whopping 43 watts, and I'm hitting 95C in temps, which is utterly wild. So yes, it has the power, but I do hope the Ally can deal with this over the long term. I can rave all I like about the amazing graphics on the Ally, but the Steam Deck is producing amazing numbers, but at 15 watts, which to me is just black magic. But back to the particular showing here, and the Ally, it just looks so much better all around. It's smooth as butter, hovering in the mid 50s. The colours are way more vibrant, such as the green on the pip itself, and everything has a sharpness to it. The Diamond City market also is totally playable, rarely dropping lower than 50 FPS. Worth noting, upon loading the city, and in fact any location in the game, and it's the same for the deck by the way, the textures, they just need a bit of time to load in. So you're going to start at 30, but then once that sorts itself out, it will go back up. Truly then, Fallout 4 is quite incredible on the Ally, and is no worse than what you'd expect on a mid-tier PC. However, as mentioned, it's also sucking up the power grid. Next is No Man's Sky, and again, it's a tour de force on the deck. This is all medium settings at 800p, and for the most part, we are at 45 to 50 frames per second on planets, hitting 60 in space. Now, what is not shown here are other areas, and I do find the game stutters quite a bit, but I put that down to the engine than I do the deck itself. Nonetheless, you will get that jarring effect throughout, especially when entering, say, a space station, and depending on your planet, you could be in for much lower FPS than what you're seeing on screen. One thing I do want to call out again though is the colours of the deck screen, where the blacks never truly feel black, and No Man's Sky in particular has such a vibrant colour palette that there is something fundamentally lacking here. It's just all a bit dull. Now, I've been playing No Man's Sky a lot on the Steam Deck this past year, and I'll be honest with you, I never really paid much attention to the cockpit, but with the Ally in comparison, it now almost feels a little blurry. The sheer fidelity of the 1080p screen is a game changer, and the only way I can explain it is perhaps using the old MetaQuest headset and jumping onto something like the G2 VR Reverb. The Steam Deck screen then, in just a year, is starting to show its age. As for the Ally, what can I say here? Because No Man's Sky plays like an utter dream. The colours are simply stunning, textures showing all the detail, and as open worlds go, it's just a child's playground. In the more barren planets, it has no issues getting as high as 70 frames per second, and as you can see in the menu here, text and icons, they're all sharp, which again, I never really thought was a major issue with the deck, but seeing it on the Ally is just a stark upgrade. Now, as we transition out of the planet, we see a drop from 77 frames per second to 33, back to 70. Note this is out of the 48Hz range of the screen for VRR, so stutters will ensue. With spikes such as this, there is no magic in the screen that can fix the stutter, but as per our friends at Digital Foundry, if you lock it to 40 frames per second, you're going to get smoothness, given it divides into 120. Now, I believe the stutters itself is very much the issue of the game engine, as it was for the deck, but in space, we are on a solid 70 to 80 frames per second, and it just feels as smooth as butter. Here, unlike Fallout 4, the power consumption is much less at 29 watts or so, but towards the end of the clip, you're going to see some major stutters at play. I have no idea if this is the Ally hardware or software or the game, but my gut instinct tells me it's the Ally software, given the incredible performance elsewhere. Of all the games I've benchmarked, this one, it really stood out for me, and I think that is mainly down to just how the screen presents the vibrancy of the worlds. Also note, have another look at my cockpit again, and just admire the detail with the text and everything else in between. Now I'll shut up and let you enjoy the rest of the clip. Resident Evil 4 Remake is next for the deck treatment, and we are at 800p medium settings. Now, as a newer title, you'd expect the deck to struggle, but it doesn't, and actually handles a lot of the effects without problem. Give or take, it's around the 40 FPS mark, and really this is a game that should be locked into a 30 FPS setting to give you that consistency. Accomplish that and it's a far more enjoyable experience. Now, later on in the game there are a lot of dark areas, and the screen, it struggles to show just how dark it is. There is always that sense of greyness to proceedings, and my assumption is the anti-glare coating they have, it just amplifies it. If you do try and go for higher frames though, as seen here in this footage, then be prepared for a lot of judder, as there will be inconsistencies throughout. And that's important to note, because I do feel that whilst the Steam Deck has a lot of pick up and play versus the Ally, I also feel you have to play around with the settings far more in the Steam Deck to maximise performance and get every ounce of that 15 watts of power. With the Ally, once you get all the shit sorted up front with the updates and all that jazz, you can just set it to a preset and away you go. Resident Evil is a great example of that, where the game settings really do need some major work on your end to get the performance where you need it, as you simply can't pump out that consistency unless you just want to aim for a low setting at 30 frames per second and be done with it. Also worth calling out again in this clip the detail of the brickwork and how it lacks versus what you are about to see on the ROG Ally. Now, I was actually a little disappointed with the Ally's performance at 1080p, and that's purely based on all the previous benchmarks that I've seen so far. Because we are below the range of 48 FPS, you're going to get those judders and stutters, so locking this to 40 FPS is the way to go to get the smoothness. Immediately though, the screen clarity just provides so much more detail, and that really is a major plus point. At 1080p, the Ally struggles to reach 40 FPS, so this particular game, it felt like 720p benchmark was needed to provide better parity, as Resident Evil 4 seems like it's just one step too far for consistent performance at medium settings for both handhelds, unless of course you want to lower it down and lock in that 30 FPS. Now you enjoy me shoot up some chickens. As we flick to the 720p resolution, the game changes. Here we are at 50 FPS and above, and because we are within VRR range, everything here is beautifully smooth. Yes, you do lose detail versus 1080p, but for me the trade-off is worth it, given the fact that the colours are still reproduced fantastically. It's another plus point to the Ally here, because whilst you can drop the deck down and play around with resolutions and turn on FSR to upscale it back, it still looks a little cheap at times, but the Ally gives you a very simple option to simply just drop down the resolution to bump up your performance, and that is a major plus point point without having to fiddle with all the settings. Now, even though we do lose that fidelity, the detail is still there, and in stark contrast to the deck, it never feels washed out. I know when the deck came to be, Valve told us the price point was painful, but on the flip side, I kind of wish they did charge us an extra $50 or $100 to get us a screen that is as capable as what we see on the Ally, because in a game like Resident Evil 4, the flexibility of VRR and the ability to hop to a lower resolution, it doesn't impact your enjoyment. Bravo ASUS, you fucking did it. Now watch me shoot up some more chickens. Lovely stuff. Now this is an interesting use case. Shadows of Doubt is still very early access. Doesn't quite have the optimizations yet, so I was curious to see how both handhelds manage this one. By the way, it's a truly stunning game. Don't just check out my review, but check out everyone else's. It really is brilliant stuff, and for me, so far, it is Indie Game of the Year. As for the deck, we are on medium settings at 800p, and I'm not going to lie, boys and girls, it's a total disaster. Whilst the game runs okay indoors around 40 FPS, the moment you start moving upstairs and heading outside, we see drops as low as 15 FPS. It's quite literally in an unplayable state on handheld, which is a shame because it's made perfectly for it. In particular, as I check out the smoke from the drain, we get a drop of 8 FPS, and throughout the game struggles to break through that 20 FPS mark on the Steam Deck, leading me to believe that this is just one game that just needs a lot of optimization. Now I'm going to let the video play out here so you can see more of the issues on Steam Deck, but I had zero hopes for the Ally when it comes to booting the game up. And my word, people, the power of the Ally totally shines through here. It's not just playable at 1080p, but at times it looks bloody superb. I could not believe the immediate difference, and 30 FPS with some tweaking should be passable in this game such as this. Now you will notice later on as I walk past that steam from the drain, the frame per seconds plummet once again, but by all means this is a huge improvement, and it left me wondering, for a game that is pixel art based by nature, does a 720p benchmark make more sense? Because after all, the loss in detail is not going to be missed as much based on that art style. So that's exactly what Reggie did. And here it is, lads, 720p, same settings as the deck, and it's night and day. Now the outside is around 35 frames per second, and even the horrible smoke that we see from the drain, it leads us nowhere lower really than 25 frames per second. For me then, the Ally is opening up more games than the deck, not just through the launchers, but in games like Shadows of Doubt, where you have an unplayable experience on deck versus something that is not just passable, but actually pretty damn good given its early access nature. Shadows of Doubt are the types of games then that are perfect for on the go. The one criticism I do have here though is of course the power consumption once again. So when I say on the go, what I'm really saying is if you have it plugged in, and it's an important question to consider when deciding between these two handhelds. Think about your own playstyle, your own games, and how you might use a handheld device. Anyway, I'll shut up so you can enjoy the rest of this clip. Now I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit of a dodgy geezer and I've made some questionable decisions in my life, and I wanted to do a benchmark for Shenmue 3 and pick up my save file from somewhere in the middle of the game, but alas, I can't bloody find it, and that's a problem because the benchmark is the opening scene and it doesn't really tell you the truth. And a particular note, the lighting in the next two clips is frankly awful, and I struggled immensely to stop it looking washed out, so do take that into consideration if you see glare or it all looks a bit blurry. What we have here on the Steam Deck though is high settings and 800p. The opening scene runs at 50 FPS, so it's off to a good start, but then we see wild drops to 26 frames per second, and I guess that's the lighting effects kicking in. Now I've noted it's very washed out in the video of mine, that's down again to my lighting, but what it does demonstrate that even though there is no harsh reflection, it does provide an almost glare to the screen. It's almost like a washed out light glare. Again, the blacks do not seem black and they all just feel a little grey. Now I leave this running because you can at least see the FPS at the top, but Reggie f***ed the recording and he f***ed it up royally, so I'm not going to make further comments on here because it's really just a bit shitty of me. Now as for the Ally, it's another huge gulf, so even though it's the same settings, remember this is running at 1080p. In this scene where Ryu, I always forget his bloody name, comes into shot with the Steam Deck, it was at what, 25 frames per second, but the ASUS here is hitting 51 frames per second. However, again, the power consumption is vastly greater at 42 watts. Just like the deck, this isn't the best recording in the world, but what you can tell is how black the cave looks inside, and this is down once again to that great screen. I'm almost bored of banging on about the screen as you are, and for those of you who've watched this in its entirety, my apologies. We use repetition in content videos knowing people skip it about, but this opening scene in Shenmue 3 is a great example whereby if you exclude all the graphical performance and just compare exclusively the colour reproduction of both handhelds, you can see why I said earlier in the review that the Ally screen is for me its greatest asset. It's what transforms it, and in scenes like this particularly, it sums it up perfectly. Now I promised you 10 games, didn't I? And I shall deliver. But for whatever reason, the Steam Deck overlay did not work for me on Phasmophobia. It's actually the worst example of a game I could pick, as everything is so bloody dark. So no doubt a few of you will drop off at this point. So feel free to head over to the final chapter where I give my answer on what unit I will sell. As for performance on the deck, Phasmophobia works like a bloody charm. All at max settings, I hasten to add. Not as strong as the Ally, but I mean, who's really haggling over the frames when they're clearly already so high? Only thing I can point out to you is the shimmering effect on the torch I'm holding. It's far more evasive to my eyes, again due to the lower resolution than what the ROG has, but either way, it's still bloody good. I won't say much more on Phas, as I think the videos tell you what you need to up at this point, and hopefully show that the gulf between the Ally and deck is perhaps far greater than just raw numbers than what we've been seeing in all the other benchmark reviews out there, because what they don't tell you is how everything actually feels to play, and the ROG, in 90% of the games tested, they just felt smoother, slicker, more vibrant and easier to play. My enjoyment of games therefore was far greater because of it. And there you have it, lads and lasses, a little dive into the differences between the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally. Now the question is, which one am I actually going for? Well, the answer is simple really. Every decision comes down to your own personal needs, innit? See, Reggie here, he uses his Steam Deck at a hotel when the missus is dulling herself up, or when I go on long flights when I need a distraction from future extortion deals. Most of the time though, I'm planted on my sofa, plugged in, enjoying a slice of gaming heaven while the family commandeers the main computer. Battery life? Nah, not a big deal for me, and quick resume and pause, again, nice features, but not game changers for me personally. The truth is, I have a shed load of games across multiple launchers that I just can't play when the urge strikes. The Steam Deck is a fantastic piece of kit, and if someone asked me right now which handheld to get between the two, I'd still say get the Steam Deck based on all its merits. But here's the thing, it's going up for sale, and that's because for me, performance is everything, and that Ally screen, it is just something you can't ignore once you've experienced it. Sure, it's got its problems, software issues, and Windows can be a right pain in the arse, but it is early in its life too. But once you get it all set up and complete, the game comparisons side by side, there's just no competition. It's not even close. So you need to ask yourself what's important to you and what kind of games you play to figure out which one to buy. And with that, my lovelies, love to you all, Reggie out.